Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this new series. When people ask, what is the message? They usually mean, what is the theme or the narrative? This is the foundation that ties together individual stories and key messages into a cohesive whole. In other words, it's the overarching theme that shapes how a message is communicated and understood. So creating a memorable narrative arc is real weakness among most candidates and others in the progressive space. PSG Consulting and Innovating for the Public Good are launching this 8-part series, exploring this intersection of story and messaging within a thematic framework. So a strong narrative introduces the key players, a vision, and a goal. It defines obstacles, identifies those standing in the way, and lays out a path to overcome conflicts and achieve the goal. For example, we see this in movies all the time. Think about the David and Goliath story in many of the movies. The weak defeats the strong. Or movies like Sleepless in Seattle, where love conquers all. In politics, this narrative structure is essential. Without it, messages are fragmented, certainly forgettable, and at sometimes even counterproductive. So it's not a tagline, it's a story, and it reinforces the moral lessons we have all grown up on, no matter what the generation. So today, in the first installment of our series, we could not begin with a better lineup of speakers, all of whom are experts in creating memorable narratives and have done it for their whole professional careers. And our moderator, Erica Williams-Simon, is one of the leading professionals in this field. We're lucky to have you, and Erica.
Thank you so much, Paige. And if you have been to any of these webinars before, you've seen me. I have helped to moderate some of these conversations, but as Paige said, I'm so excited today because I get to really talk about the thing that I honestly believe is most important. I believe that all the time, but especially given where we are right now, the state of the country, the state of the world, and in particular, the state of our movement, I could not think of a better time to be discussing narrative. And so I'm going to share some thoughts, maybe get on a little soapbox in the beginning, and then open it up for our brilliant panelists, Laura Hughes and Joseph Phelan. I think their bios are going to be dropped in the chat today, but as Paige said, both are considered leading experts in the world of narrative, and have spent years advising, not just advising, doing the work of narrative, and also advising others on how to do it and how to do it well. And so the first thing I want to do is actually just do a little bit of level setting and give some definitions. There are many definitions out there. Our panelists may also have their own. I'm going to share mine because I think we use the term on our side, narrative, a lot to mean a lot of different things. And that's okay, right? Because the general public does not need to know and does not care about all of the language and how we describe our strategies and our tactics. But as people who ostensibly are in the work and in the business of doing this and doing this well and trying to win and trying to create a new reality, I think it's important to be clear. And so a narrative is not just a story. Story, right, is a series of events that has a plot, it has characters, it has a beginning, a middle, and end, all of those things. Surprisingly enough, as much as we talk about story, sometimes we don't do that well either, because I can't tell you how many email communications I've seen, how many ads I've seen, how many messages I've seen that actually have no characters, that talk about systems and structures without people. And so that's what a story is. A story must have those things. But a narrative isn't just a story. A narrative is the pattern of meaning, the patterns of meaning that tie those stories together and give rise to new stories, right? And so we can talk a lot about individual stories and who should be in them and who should be telling them and where they should be posted and what the platforms are. All of that is important when we think about narrative strategy. But it is not just that. Narrative is that overarching pattern of meaning. And I like to say that if messaging is what you say and framing is how you say it, narrative is actually what people hear when you say it, right? And so here's a good example of that. During the pandemic, do you all remember that moment? This was kind of early on when we were all just starting to figure out working from home. And there was this guy, it was this white guy, professional. I think he was in like a suit and tie, but he was in his home because we were all trying to figure out that. And he was zooming in for, maybe it was BBC, it was some interview where he was providing commentary. And he was very professional sounding. And then all of a sudden you see like a little baby walk in the background. And then maybe like 15 seconds later, you see a woman fly through the door, very like Seinfeld Kramer, right? She like flew through the door, grabbed the kid. There was another kid. It was like chaos in the back. Very cute moment, representative of our transition to working from home. But when it first happened, if you went on social, there were a lot of people saying, oh my God, did you see the guy whose nanny came in and grabbed the kid? And there was all this stuff, right? The actual story, the truth, the players, the plot, what happened was that that was his wife and those were her children. That's the story, right? That's the message. But narrative and the patterns of meaning that people were familiar with based on their life experiences, based on the stories they'd seen before, had that woman as a domestic worker, because that was the frame. That was what they heard in their minds that related to narrative. So narrative shows up at the personal level, at the cultural level, and at the structural level. And so if in your personal life, if you are in a world in which all of your peers and everyone you know has nannies and most of them are women of color, if you have consumed television and movies that show domestic workers as primarily women of color, and if at the structural level you have any sense of awareness of kind of the systems and structures and barriers and pay inequity and all of the realities that have to do with women of color in the workforce, those narratives, that backdrop, that landscape is what a story plays onto. And so as progressives and people who do the work of politics, oftentimes we are very quick to jump right to the stories and not think about what are people hearing? What is that value set, those cultural narratives and ideas that are already existing in the landscape and already existing in hearts and minds that our messaging and our framing and our storytelling is landing in. That's what we need to do better. And so Paige referenced this idea of a narrative arc. I think it's really, really important to talk about an arc as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning has to clearly identify the current state, and I would say the current problem state, right? What is our reality? What does the world look like today? And frankly, what's wrong with that people are experiencing and feeling? And then we have to, at the end of the story, but the end of that narrative, be able to articulate a vision for the world we want to live in. And oftentimes, this is the part we forget about. What is a compelling vision? What is the story that says who we want to be and what the world should look like? And then the middle of that story, from beginning to where we want to go, has to situate us and a clear value proposition. How are you the vehicle to get? How are we the vehicle to get from where we are to where we want to go? If we don't have all three of those things in place, we do not have a compelling, effective narrative arc. Now, we know the other side has done this really well, right? Intellectually dishonest, sometimes evil, we can say all the things, but we know that the beginning of the story has many villains and one core problem, right? They've created all these characters. The villains are people of color. The villains are Black folks. The villains are immigrants. The villains are trans people. The villain is DEI. But there's a core problem that they've framed our existing reality around, right? And that is kind of liberal values run amok, including in our infrastructure and our laws. The world that we want to live in is one, and their future is one of law and order and American dominance, right? And in the middle, they've positioned themselves as the way to get there with very little details about how, right? People don't really care that much about the how. They care about being able to see someone that has a solution. And so that's their narrative arc. The question is, what is ours? Now, here's the thing. Narrative strategy is integrating all of our communications and all of our messaging, whether we're talking about in organizing, yes, thank you, Zoom, thumbs up, and fireworks. Whether we're talking about in organizing, whether we're talking about in cultural production, in movies, social media, all of that being integrated so that we have a key narrative arc that ties all of those pieces together. Here's the thing, we've done this before, right? A really good example would be, and there are many, and in fact, Opportunity Agenda put out a report with some case studies a couple years ago. I think there were maybe 5 case studies that had everything from the death penalty to animal rights and all the things that we've done well before. But one that I love to talk about is marriage equality. Because it's a very good example of how changing the narrative arc and paying attention to that can actually make the difference. And so for those of us on the progressive side, it seemed like a very clear story, a very clear message of justice and equality and rights, right? This is what is important here. And so the beginning reality that we started with was there is a group of people that do not have the same rights as other people. And that's important. That matters to us. Justice matters. Fairness matters to us. And so if you follow that story to its inevitable end, the end state that we are envisioning is a world where everyone has equal rights, where they have equal rights and access to this system, this identity, this kind of structure, this legal structure that is marriage. And in the middle is us. And we are here as the freedom fighters. And we are going to get the laws changed so that people have access to equal rights. That's a great story. And it is compelling to some. Unfortunately, it's compelling to a small percentage of people, and most of them already agreed. But when we started shifting, when the narrative shifted to being one, not about rights, not about laws, not even about justice, but about love, right? About love. In the beginning state, we had a world in which your neighbor, your teacher, the teenager that bags your groceries, is existing in a reality in which they're not able to love. They are not able to feel the love. Their parents are putting them out because of their identity. And so that kid that you love, actually is not being loved by his mom because his mom is putting him out. That teacher is going home lonely. All of these stories, right? Because we have a world now, the existence and the story that we're telling is about love, not about rights and laws. And so then we were able to position ourselves as the solution there and change the frame that then changed the messaging, that then changed the story, that then changed the narrative strategy that ultimately changed the world, right? And so I give that example. There are, again, are countless others. Number one, so that we can really understand what we're talking about here when we say narrative versus just story or versus just messaging. But number two, and this is where I get on my soapbox a little bit, a pet peeve of mine is when we say that we are bad at this. Look, I get it. We are not doing a good job right now. We are not. And the royal we, right, our movement, we are not doing a good job. And humility says we have to name that and we have to own it. But shame is when we get into, we're bad at this, we can't do this. That's not true. We know how to do this. We have done this before. We are talking about how do we tell a compelling story about humanity, right? About who we are, about the values that actually tie us together. We have lost our way in our storytelling, right? And that is largely because of the systems and structures and the philanthropy and the voices that we have excluded and the people that we have chosen to listen to and the processes that we have put in place on our side and the distance that we have created between the political class and everyday people. There are all sorts of reasons why we have become bad at this, but we are not actually incapable, and we have historically done this, right? This is what we know about the arc of history bending towards justice. It is actually on our side. And so to me, our task right now is not to say, woe is us, is not to look at them and say, man, they're so much better than we are, but to get ourselves together and say, we know how to do this. Let's get the right people in the room. Let's give people the right resources. Let's break down the structures, the philanthropic models that are making us stagnant, that are preventing innovation, that are preventing the voices that are actually telling the compelling stories from being in the room and from having the power that, frankly, they already have. Let's do that. And then we can together come up with a narrative strategy that gets us back where we belong, right? And where we belong is in the position to actually shift the hearts and minds of this nation. So that was my soapbox. I'm very passionate about it. But I just wanted to kick us off by setting the frame that we do know how to do this and we can do it well. In today's conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about what we've learned thus far in the work that we've done as progressives in the movement and what we need to be doing better. So let's shift now, and I'm going to toss to Laura. So Laura, that was my little soapbox. I'm going to give you space for yours. Tell me, in the work that you've done, I first met you when you were doing brilliant narrative work at Policy Link, specifically focused on housing and justice, but I know since then you've also done more work around democracy. Tell us your take on the landscape and what we should be doing differently.
Absolutely. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Paige. And Joseph, I am delighted to be here today. And narrative is also something I feel super strongly about. And so I'm going to build on Erica's definition of narrative to share that narrative for me is my like easy default is that if, a constellation of stars is the narrative. That's the pattern. The stars are the individual stories that make up the constellation, that make up the narrative. And so that's what I try to hold. And I was formerly the director of narrative strategy at PolicyLink. I've also done narrative strategy around democracy, housing justice, birth equity, LGBTQ rights, and child welfare. And in all of those, I am trying to identify like the patterns of persuasive storytelling that create tipping points in public consciousness. Okay, so creating tipping points in public consciousness. And so, you know, as I most recently worked at a policy organization, I would say I'm not a policy person, right? So let me just level set on that. But I was able to do very successful storytelling there with powerful folks on the grassroots level. So today, like what didn't go well? Like there's a lot of smart people in the room. We spend a lot of time beating us up, beating our own selves up, doing deep thinking, especially in the climate, about what went wrong. I'm going to try to ask you to hold a couple of things I'm going to share with you with curiosity. Right? These are my musings. And I hope that some of them you don't like, right? That means to me that I'm moving in the right direction, but hold these with curiosity for me. So the first thing I'm going to ask you, and if folks want to drop into the chat, feel free. What does democracy smell like? What does democracy taste like? And the last one, what does democracy sound like? Okay. So in addition to trying to activate a different side of your brain and a different way of thinking about things, I'm also evoking the core emotions that are necessary that everyone can connect to that are in powerful storytelling, right? So when I worked with um, uh, national housing advocates and movement leaders to create a housing justice toolkit that was around how to tell stories that move folks towards everyone in America has a safe and affordable home. What we knew going in is that 67% of Americans believe something needed to be done on housing. 67% of Americans, right? But what we weren't in agreement about is what that needed to be. Right. So people were like, my kids can't because they graduated. They, you know, other folks were like, I want myself and my full multi-unit family. Like people just didn't agree that what needed to happen. Right. But part of when I worked with the housing advocates and what I realized is that we're really good about what the other side is doing. Folks could tell me what they hated about NIMBY. They could tell me every single policy, the problem with YIMBY folks, and everything we're up against. But when I said, okay, what is housing justice? Like, what's our aspirational future? People were stumped. We get quiet. Right. And so I think that is the first thing I really want to hold is that we need to be offering an aspirational future. And for me, it wasn't until close to a year later of having worked with folks on housing justice that I knew that housing justice to me smelled like the smell of tomato leaves. So I picked tomatoes with my mom growing up, and the smell of tomato would linger. And that's what a home meant to me. Right. So when I share that, you're hitting in people's core emotions, right? You're getting and you're evoking in them. So when I ask you what democracy feels like, smells like, I'm sure you can tell me everything that's along. But what are we telling? What type of stories and narratives are we holding that evoke the core emotions that we want to motivate folks to take action from? And you know, the second one I really want to hold is that I believe there's a decline in solidarity storytelling. I'm not saying that there's a decline in solidarity, but I can tell you that we saw over this past election season and other places that there absolutely is a decline in stories that talk about solidarity. Not the light, fluffy solidarity, right? The true solidarity that requires struggle. It means you have to establish shared norms, that you have to have a cultural mindset, you have to recognize interdependence, right? We tell stories of solidarity like we just line up and it's just that easy. And part of the reason why I'm concerned about this lack of storytelling in this space is because one, it's used as a wedge between us. A huge wedge between people of color. But also, if you think about these kind of stories about like, what are the stories that say we're in this together, right? That also involve that we're going to struggle together, we're going to create these shared norms. And so I'll talk a little bit about Desmond Meade, who is a brilliant individual, the head of Florida Rights Restoration. And in his work, restoring voting rights for folks who had felonies, he talks about that he would go to Trump rallies and have conversations with folks and say, you know, do you have anybody in your family? Wouldn't you want someone in your family who made a mistake to be able to vote one day or to be able to like reconcile, make a change? And he said overwhelmingly that people said yes. Coupled with this, I just talked to my wife a few days ago. We live in upstate New York. We drove past some of our neighbors' house that had the "Don't Tread on Me" and Trump signs still up, proudly displayed. And my wife said to me, if there's a fire at that house, we're not stopping to help. I was like, damn, really? That's not who we are? Also, she was like, I meant every word of that, right? So I think that we're not telling the stories that we're in this together, right? Instead, we're falling into some of the stories around scarcity. Two more things, I'll go quick. The next one is I worked on a toolkit that was a group that was in support of human and civil rights organizations across the nation that were talking about industrial policy and countering abusive preemption. And to those of you who said, what are those things? I hope I wasn't the only one. Like when they engaged me, I was like, couldn't tell you a clue, right? And then they started telling me what amendments, and then like it was A, B, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I don't know none of that. And I also know that my mother, who's 81, doesn't know. And I also know that my daughter, who's 19, who voted, doesn't know either, right? So how are we telling stories in that kind of way? And what we came up with was actually what we, a storytelling toolkit around, it was titled Democracy in Action. And it was about how do we tell stories about your day-to-day activities being about democracy that allow the deep narratives hold that you belong, right? And then we tested it to like, what was the possibility of us telling stories that align with people's individual and community agency, but would move them to action? The folks said, if I saw this message, I'm more likely to take action. And what we saw within that is that going to a PTO meeting is an act of democracy. Going to the library is an act of democracy. There's lots of things now that I would like to have not thought of are exemplary of democracy that indeed are. And I think one of the things that we've created is on accident or, unintended consequences of prioritizing certain things is that people see democracy as like presidential and voting for, and that's it, right? Instead of thinking that our everyday existence. And the last thing I would say is that as we think, I think innovation is critical here, right? We can innovate and bring in the knowledge we have. But let me also say, if you are holding narratives and you haven't thought about your audience and who you're talking to, we got big problems, right? And if you're one of those folks that say, I'm talking to everybody, which to me translates into you're talking to no one, right? And so, people always get a little bristly when I say that, but I'm like, you got broad mess. Oh, goodness gracious, we might be in trouble, right? And the other side of it, as I think about innovation, is that if you aren't doing things on Twitch, if you don't know what Fizz is, if you don't know who Insay Ufot is, and you don't understand why 92% of Black women who are the greatest believers in democracy are really frustrated and angry, and if you don't know what Afrofuturism is, there's tons of innovation right in front of us that we need to grapple and move towards. So I will pause there and kick to Joseph.
Thanks, Laura. It's great to be here with you and everybody else today. So I do a lot of talking on the internet, and it's hard for me to do it when there's not chatter happening. So I'm going to do a really crazy thing and actually put my email as well into the chat here, and you can email me your feedback because it helps me. And I know that Laura, Erica, and Paige will also give me wonderful feedback. So a little bit about me, my dad is off the boat from Ireland, right? So like story is like breath, right? For our people. So, I'm not a fan of stereotypes, but we'll lean into the one about Irish people and stories. But the reality is humans are actually story animals. It's how we understand the world, right? It's how we make sense. So we have LLMs, we have maybe the creeping artificial general intelligence. Those things make sense by doing a lot of data analysis really quickly, large amount. We do that, but we turn that into story as a way to remember and understand our world, right? So I spent a lot of time doing strategic communications for issue organizing, mostly in the racial justice field. And I've done a lot of work across the country with many organizations trying to figure out this narrative thing. And I love a conversation about narrative. I love splitting hairs. Like I'm like, Erica, we need to get a drink and talk about your definitions of narrative and story, And ultimately, it doesn't matter. Because what matters is to get out there and start doing with a couple of really core things to understand. And I'm going to build off of kind of what Erica and Laura, you both shared, which is for me, when I think of narrative and story, the strongest currency of meaning is not truth, it's story. So that's one thing to comprehend, right? The strongest currency of meaning is not truth, it is story. which again, doesn't mean that we should lie, right? My grandma would come up out of her grave and smack me on the back of the hand if I said we should lie, right? But I do think that generally progressives have a problem because they think that, oh my God, that's not the truth. Oh my God, that's not the facts. The reality is that doesn't matter when it comes to compelling and moving meaning out into the world, right? It doesn't mean we leave it behind. We can bring it into compelling stories, but we need to kind of understand that. I used to do a lot of media trainings for people across the country, all sorts of people. And I would tell them that I'm not actually interested in the truth. I'm interested in winning. And people get like, you know, a lot of clutching of pearls and like, oh my gosh, because they thought I meant we couldn't be interested in the truth. When we're thinking about building narrative power and we're thinking about stories in this moment, we also need to really understand power itself and understand that this is a contest for power, right? The work that Laura is referring to and all this amazing, the housing narrative work, all of that does not happen in a vacuum. There are people out here trying to create a counter narrative utilizing their stories, right? This is a contest for power. And if we don't understand this contest for power, we're going to lose. So these are the kind of caveats around all of this stuff, okay? And then I'm going to really pick up on Laura's kind of last example here. Again, we could spend days sitting here and talking about like, what is the right narrative, right? Like I think the marriage equality one is a really important one, right? Like it's a great example. And I'll see your marriage equality, I'll raise you another movement, right? People ask me all the time, like, can you give me an example from history of a effective narrative movement or campaign? I'm like, yeah, the civil rights movement, highly effective at transitioning what it means to be, like, if you remember, think of like an iconic image of the civil rights movements, people holding signs that I am a man, right? And if we look at modern movements around racial justice, we have similar sentiments carried through, updated, that's not just men, right? But similar sentiments that are updated and carried through. The thing that I want to pull out about the civil rights movement that I think is really important is, you know, in the 2 decades of the 60s, if we're thinking about that time period, we're also considering media and media infrastructure. And at the time, TV was brand new. And TV was suddenly a way that you could get in front of millions of people that you could not get in front of before, right? And you could do so visually. It was a new storytelling element that was very compelling. It was a new media. And so similar to what Laura said here, like if we're not thinking about Twitch, right? If we're not thinking about our audiences first and the channels to reach them and the stories that move those audiences through those channels to advance our bigger piece of meaning, as Erica said, which is our narrative, then we're going to miss out, right? It starts with understanding if this is a contest of power, if this contest of power around narrative is taking place in an economic sphere and a political sphere, what are the balance of forces? Who do we need to move on our side, right? And again, it's not happening in a vacuum. It is a competition, okay? It is a fight. So I think that's a really important point. I'm less these days interested in like, what is the one key narrative, and far more interested in who are the audiences? How do we reach those audiences? What stories actually speak to those audiences in a very culturally relevant way? And what narratives does that point back to? And again, like Erica said, stories are not a list of facts and figures. It's very simply, you know, a telling of events in a certain order that typically have characters in conflict and foreshadowing of what might be a solution, right? These are stories that we can do. And I think this kind of prompt of like, we're not bad at stories, but we've chosen to be. I think maybe I'm putting words in your mouth there, Erica, but I do think there's a lot of choosing to be when it comes to particularly like, well, facts and figures, right? I've been really concerned also as we think about this of kind of oppositional right-wing conservative forces are using issues, are using audience first thinking in order to identify what issues they move in order to galvanize a base. Progressive sides often think about what issues first and how do I move audiences to those issues, right? There's relevancy for both, but it's a compelling question of where do you start into this conversation, right? Of where we're going. And then I just want to add one more thing, and I think this is a really important point too, is it's easy to collapse. So again, we can get into fights about definitions, and I'm a nerd about it. We can talk about it all day, and I don't want to do that. I want to focus on audience and channel. And it's very easy to collapse. Well, narrative, story, message, talking point, right? And that's incorrect, right? We need to start thinking about if we're advancing narrative. If I am a impact litigation person, if I'm a lawyer and I'm going to bring impact litigation, what cases I choose to move tells a story and advances a narrative. If I'm an organizer on the door, how I talk about whatever the thing is I'm talking about is a story and advances a narrative, right? There are many ways to advance story and narrative. It doesn't have to just be like, I think we'd be losing if we're like, if suddenly all the lawyers in the call is like, well, that's it. I'm going to go start being an Instagram star. Like, I mean, you can do that, feel free, and not the solution, right? Lean into story and narrative where you are and think about those things correctly. And so to kind of close it out, you know, post-election, I'm sure, and if you could raise your hand in the chat, you would maybe heard this conversation too. The left and progressives need a Joe Rogan, right? I am sure someone in your life said that. You saw it on LinkedIn, you saw articles about it, whatever. And I think this is a really prime example when we're thinking about building narrative power. It happens through all sorts of ways, including retail communications. But to think of Joe Rogan necessarily as a right or left character is incorrect, especially in today's day and age, and especially when we're thinking about audiences and audience complexity. Joe Rogan is a cultural figure. He is not political first. He is culture first. If you want to guess at what culture that is, cool. I mean, it's like mostly MMA. You know, we could talk about kettlebells, like seed oils are bad, right? It's a very particular niche culture. And Joe Rogan has FU money. He couldn't get canceled on Spotify, right? He's culture first. So if the left and progressives want to build a Joe Rogan, they need to build someone that is culture first and politics second. And the mistake of assuming that Joe Rogan is a left or right character means then you engage with cultural figures or you don't. So Musk went on to Joe Rogan, Kamala Harris didn't. There's terms for agreement of engaging in that type of media, and you can choose to engage in that media or not, right? And if you choose to engage with those cultural figures, it signals to larger bases of audiences who you are and if you are relevant or important, right? So when we're thinking about narrative and we're thinking about culture, we want to be thinking about, it's not just how do I move a story in the 3 weeks leading up to an election and that's going to change narrative, right? The best time to start doing narrative work is 5 years ago. The worst time is tomorrow, right? But in order to advance narratives over time, we need to build the power to do that, which includes the infrastructure, the connectivity, the toolkits, the relationships, right? The content creators, the cultural creators, the organizers, the impact litigators, moving in the same narrative direction, telling compelling stories that match our audiences and can move them forward. That's what I got.
That's great, Joseph. Thank you. Thank you both, and Laura too. And just, I want to pick up on something which actually ties into, I'm going to start also bringing in some questions that folks have submitted already. But you talked about the civil rights movement. And, you know, one of the many, I mean, that's always the go-to as the model movement. I think around the world, folks look at that movement. And I think one of the many things that was brilliant about it, which I think is different from a lot of our political movements today, is that there was a spirit and soul component to that, right? And this is my personal area of work, is looking at kind of faith narratives, spiritual narratives, which, you know, the left does not like to talk about. We are afraid, we don't like to engage in that. But when we talk about what moves people, when we talk, why is culture what it is? Why do people engage and connect with certain content and certain influencers and certain creators? Is because they're not afraid to talk about belonging and identity in a real way. I'm not talking about identity politics, which we can get into, and that's why I bring that up, because that was one of the questions. How do we talk about values versus identity politics? Which we can, you all are welcome to answer that question. But I do think that there is something about our side that has been afraid in recent years, and again, we haven't always been this way, but afraid to tap into something deeper. Who people are. We are, as humans, we have deep soul needs and soul hungers. And we have ceded that territory to the right, who has moved in on that space with tribalism and otherism and othering and Christian nationalism. And we need a different story there. We need a different narrative there that actually speaks to that part of people. And until we are able to do that as effectively as I would argue the civil rights movement did, And some of that is about the figures that were at the head, and we know when we say head, that doesn't just mean the people who were in front of the microphones and who history is telling those stories, but even on the ground. Some of it is about who those people were and their own identity as kind of spiritual, faithful beings. But we got to be bold and willing to talk about that and tap into. And for cultural figures, that often just means places we don't want to go.
Can I add something? Because
Yeah,
I
please
think that's
jump in, Paige.
fascinating. One of the things that Innovating for the Public Good recognize that we need to do and a lot better is understand our audiences and understand not only how they are politically, but how they work, how they operate in the world culturally, religiously, etc. So that's a key point that we really, as a movement, need to understand much more deeply our audiences and explore that in very different ways. As we think about the right, who do understand their audiences, it's very intentional. They have a message that evokes a certain feeling, that very intentional about the feeling they want to evoke, that leads to a certain action, that it's part of a larger narrative. And you see that in whatever issue, whatever issue they discuss. And so it's very important for us to really sit back and say, okay, how do we reach people we normally don't reach in their, as Erica was saying, in their soul and where they live, as opposed to, talking about issue A or issue B or, something like that.
Can I jump in? Is that okay? We're in the jumping in phase. I would even say we are not good about talking to people who are with us. like if we think, having done a lot of work on the ground, right, and thinking about this from a political standpoint, right, of elections, the most time that we get the most money we get on the ground to move content to people, to get them to vote, not to persuade them, to get them to vote, is 3 weeks before the election.
Right.
And then we have no money for 3 years to engage those same people and move them into democratic practice, similar to what you were talking about, Laura. Like, what is democracy? Like, what does housing justice smell like? It smells like tomato plants. I love it's so beautiful in metaphor. And like, what does democracy smell like? What does democracy feel like? Well, to me, I live in a swing district, so to me, it feels like every 4 years I get a lot of junk mail and I gotta go vote. That's a really not a great way for us to be building power over time. So we're thinking about building narrative power through the use of story in a compelling way. This like tried and true communications practices is like, you got to keep saying it until you're tired of saying it. That's going to be the first time someone hears you. So if we're saying it for 3 weeks before an election, we haven't even got tired yet. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, if I can add too, I think it's always startling to folks when we're really clear about who we're talking to, and then if you dive into the audience, the folks that really resonate with you, and we recognize that we're talking to the same 10% of folks that are part of our anti-racist space. This is part of Policy Link's audience segmentation that they offer that's publicly available. And so what we're really doing is we're telling stories in a way that resonates with the people who believe just like we do, right? When there's a ton of folks that are in our advocate base that cross over all different kind of ways that have different beliefs. And I think the other thing I would say that building on the conversation is like, how do we tell stories now, not 30 days before, like the 5 years now, yesterday, 5 years ago, all the things that Joseph said, when we really talk about what the Democratic Party about is common sense. Like, people know what we're about, right? Right now, people don't know what we're about. And we've gotten them, that argument can go in lots of ways. We went after so-and-so's group instead of this one, but people really generally don't know what we're about, right? The other side of it is that I try not to spend a bunch of time thinking about our opposition because I don't always find it so useful. But one lesson that's really clear is that one of the things that the Trump administration and the campaign did really well is that everything they did boiled down to belonging. It's us versus them. And if you play it out over any issue, if you boil it down, you keep asking yourself, why, you get to do it like therapy. Why is this? Why is this? You get to, it's us versus them. And they're masterful at it. And the question for us shouldn't be like, how do we counter that? That's the absolutely wrong question. Countering it is too late. What are we seeding and saying that we are about? What is it that when people know that voting for a Democratic candidate at any level boils down to? What will it boil down to? And, God willing, don't let it be us versus them, right? That's everything I say.
So here's my question. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second, not that the devil needs an advocate, but so some people say, look, it's easier for them to do that, right? Oh my gosh, Zoom, got to take those, got to take that off. Some would say it's easier for them to do that, right? But we're the big tent. There's too many of us, too many different identities, too many different perspectives, too many different experiences. How in the world can we craft a quote unquote single narrative? How can we have a point of view about who we are when part of our identity is that we are diverse and we welcome all? How do you respond to that? Because I've heard that pushback a lot. I know y'all have some answers. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Laura, but I am going to say that this, to me, this ties a little bit into your original point about different solidarity stories, right? That solidarity does not mean uniformity. But so how do we start talking about what it looks like to craft a narrative, even with our identity as quote unquote the big tent, right?
So I can go. So no one ever said, like, where do we ever fall into the trap, like, that we don't value complexity, right? Like, we are complex being. I can be for water equity and climate resilience and occasionally not use a reusable water bottle. It happens, right? I am a Black queer woman. My wife goes and eats a Chick-fil-A. That's the complexity, right? We can wrestle it out and have an argument, but like, we are actually able to do that, right? And I think the other side of it is that I'm not suggesting that we have one story that we tell. I'm suggesting that we hold the core emotions that we are trying to evoke as folks feel like, I'm a Democrat. Like, what makes me proud? What does it boil down to, right? Like, and most of the communities I've worked with, I really challenge them. I'm like, how do you tell a story about housing justice? How do you tell a story about birth equity? How do you tell a story about democracy that's grounded in love and abundance? It may be hard because it's what we're not used to, but it certainly is not impossible. And I think part of what I'm trying to say is that when we tell the solidarity stories, it is about folks that are all part of the Democratic Party who have different views. I remember distinctly, I think it was from, I was working on one of the kind of what we call rich storytelling areas. So the area that we encouraged everyone to tell stories with as a frame, right? Like, here's like all the stories you tell should fall into. And it was around housing justice, and it came up as safety and privacy. The safety and privacy is like a really funny thing. So one of the women said, I want to be able to come home, drive into my garage, close the door, and do whatever I want inside my own house. That doesn't mean she's not a Democrat, but like, privacy is a funny thing. And we're like, ooh, is privacy? But like, we're complex beings. She's allowed to do that. At the same time, she can look across the street, see her neighbors, and see them as neighbors first without wondering if they're renters or homeowners. Like, we can do that, and we can tell stories about how we have done that. And I think the other side of it is requires us to not walk away from people, right? So there's some places that we say we'll never win there. We won't, so we don't do investments in storytelling there. And that's a really worrisome part for me, because what we've actually seen is that because we walked away is where Republicans went in, right? So that's what I say. Joseph, what are you thinking?
Oh man, I'm going to pick up your last thread and then I'll circle around to the question. I think this piece about leaving power on the table, right? So, well, that's a red district, that's a red state, that's whatever that is. So we don't actually go there. Yeah, well, the opposition has no problem going there, and they will go wherever there's a vacuum. And not only will they go where there's a vacuum, they'll bring the fight to our front door and try and take our people. I mean, we're seeing this more and more and more. And I think that that's a really important piece of this, right? So it's not as though, like, you know, we're talking about narrative and story, right? I started doing organizing work 20 years ago. Arguably, we weren't using the word narrative and story, but we were doing narrative and story work, right? We had big ideas and meaning that we're trying to make, and we were developing people to tell really compelling stories through whatever channels they could, if that's organizing, if that's media, if that's, again, legal, in order to advance those big ideas and meaning. And our opposition has been building infrastructure to do this and doing this for arguably at least 5 decades. But if you really want to kind of get into it, close to a century, depending on how you want to define this work. And today we're talking about narrative as though, like, this is brand new. Like, so, you know, so like, I think there's a piece here of, this is a great question. Like, how do we what is the one idea, what is the one value that will unite our side? And I think the opposition has a great way of doing us versus them. I don't think that us versus them necessarily works for us as much because of maybe of our values. And there is an us versus them here. And we have to be willing to say what the us versus them is, right? So like, are you a billionaire who's focused on profits over the well-being of everybody else? You're a them. That's it, right? And if you do that, you actually have a majority. Like if you want to look at polling and testing and people's economic attitudes in this country, you have a large swath of the country at that point. If you want to talk about audience specificity, right? Like there's a large section of this country that is highly, highly progressive on economic issues, period. And fairness, period. And then we can have other conversations about what are the other us's versus them. I thought your example, Laura, is great. Like looking across at my neighbor and seeing them as a neighbor first, someone within my community first. I think that, there's a piece here that like then requires a kind of leaning into our better angels while also being strategic and ruthless, right? So like my neighbor may have a sign up that I disagree with, but they're going to be my neighbor and I'm going to build a relationship with them with the hopes that I'm going to move them along over the course of time, right? And that becomes really critical. I used to do construction and I used to be a carpenter's helper for a very long time. And I had to work one day. It was the day that George Zimmerman got acquitted for killing Trayvon Martin. And we went to lunch and I was with another guy, I was with the boss and another guy. And the other guy started playing on the TV in the place we grabbed lunch, the whole thing. And he starts going off because he owns the gun. He's weighing the gun rights. He thinks it's great that George Zimmerman got off, whatever. And I'm sitting there like, he's holding a ladder for me after lunch. Like we're going on a roof and this dude's holding a ladder for me. So what do I say to him in this moment? And as I was trying to figure it out, because now I'm stalling to answer your question, as I was trying to figure it out, the boss was like, well, actually, and the boss, who is also a gun owner in the same online forums around gun ownership and gun rights, starts to use language that's relevant to this guy about what is happening and make meaning in a different way. And he's the boss, so whatever kind of points of like, control there. But by the end of the day, this guy was singing a little bit of a different tune when it came to the acquittal of George Zimmerman killing Trayvon Martin. And it was because the person who was talking to him was able to use the same language and audience specificity. And so it's interesting to think of like, yeah, how big of a circle do we want to draw around an us versus them scenario? And like, at what point do we then fight within that circle for what's the winning ideas within that circle? Like, that's also a thing. Our opposition is not hegemonic, I think, Erica. And, like, if we want to look at immigration, Trump thinks one thing, Steve Bannon thinks another thing, Elon Musk thinks another thing. That is not a unified view of immigration, right? And there's an us versus them mentality at the same time. So just to kind of make it a little more complicated.
Let me respond to this because I think that there are a number of narratives that we can use, but they tap into fundamental American values. And so if we can create those narratives that evoke those values, I think that's a key to a successful narrative. The other thing, they do us versus them, and they create enemies according to who you are. We need to create enemies that we should create enemies in terms of what you do. And so it's not who you are as a person, as an individual, it's what you're doing to hurt other people. And so that's part of the narrative, identifying the enemy by what they do, not who they are.
That's good, Paige. And it's a common debate too in the like narrative world about do you need a villain to tell a good story? I think practice would say yes. There's some philosophical questions about that, right? But most good stories do have a villain. We tend to, on our side, like to make the villain the system. Here's what's funny about that. One, not a great character. Two, the right has actually already done that as well, right? They've made the system villain too, so maybe that's not the best one for us to choose, right? So, but I also like what Laura said about, similarly, I think it's smart for us to look and see what the opposition has done, because you do have to know and understand your opposition. But I get in the spirit of what is our focus, what is our future that we're imagining together. I think we look at that. I think we say, okay, noted. This is what they've done. but our task is not to counter. Right. Our task is to create something different, something new, something that is reflective of who we are and our values, that is smarter than we have been recently. But I think it's fair to say that our challenge is going to be to create a different vision, not just one that is reactive to what the opposition has said. And Joseph, I see you in the chat. The answer about the villain question is yes, absolutely, absolutely.
The other thing,
Laura,
sorry.
okay, no, Laura, and then Paige, and then we'll wrap. Go for it. Okay, Paige, you first, and then Laura.
Oh, okay. One of the things that we have to know is, and picking up on something Joseph said, they are constantly communicating. Right now, the Trump, octopus of organizations is on the air all across the country with their messages. And right after the election, they raised money so they could be on the air, pushing his agenda out and identifying the problems. There are ads on Medicare, there are ads on Medicaid and the problems with that. And so they create an operating environment so that they can plow through it and continue to hurt the American public. As Joseph said, we wait until the even year or a couple of months in the even year. And so we need to, use opportunities to communicate what they're doing, but be constantly communicating through paid, through earned, et cetera, because that's what they do. And they create an operating environment that helps them achieve their nefarious goals.
I think the only thing I was going to say, and this is hard for me personally and professionally, is that I really try not to think about folks as enemies, right? As soon as we move them into the villain kind of space, we fall into the same traps of seeing them as irretractable, that we can't engage with them and things like that. And this is not like a Pollyannish approach, right? There is research that says individualism, which, the United States is all about, it doesn't have to be counter to equity. And I hope that it's not, because the future that I'm envisioning for Americans does not include that there are going to be losers, right? And so we have to really wrestle with that. And I think, for anyone who is kind of like, it doesn't work, check out, Obama ran this beautiful campaign around hope. And how many of us would have told him not a chance that will work, right? So I think I'm asking us to wrestle differently, right? To lean into things differently than we have before, because I know that the American people want something different.
I think that's a really, really important point, and circles a lot back to what you were saying, Erica, around faith and larger values. I think that's a really important point.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I just want to quickly, as we wrap, and I know Laura has to hop and we're all going to close off shortly. But one question that came in the chat, I've kind of woven some of the other questions into comments and remarks, or have heard them answered throughout. But one specific one that I think is worth naming was about who the us is, right? Who are the storytellers? Are we talking about the Democratic Party and all? And I think the answer is no, we're not talking about a party. I'm really clear about that. And I think everyone on this call, I believe, is clear about that too. To the extent that a party wants to figure it out and get in line, go ahead, feel free to do so. But what we're talking about is values. And so who the storytellers are is going to vary, who the voices are, who the messengers are. But the us here, and this is part of what the task is defining that core set of values in a way that is clear, the way that it resonates, so people can see themselves in that. But I just want to really name and be very clear that we're not talking about a party. In the question, there was some comment about, well, are they really big tent? Your guess is as good as mine, Hector. The party is doing some interesting things right here, right now. But I do believe that there is still, and again, my background, I think most of us on this call, our work has been born of movements, not party politics. And frankly, movements are actually what shift culture. And culture usually comes from, I don't even like the phrase bottom up, because culture is not bottom, culture actually is the top. But movements come from people and from communities. And so if anything, that's who we're talking about. And to the extent then that bubbles up and impacts the funding and the structures that exist in the party, then, so be it. And I actually do think that would help us win along the way. But anything else? Otherwise, I'm going to say, Laura and Joseph, thank you so much for your time. Laura, I know you have to run, but I think this was a great beginning. As Paige said, there are going to be more in the series. We're going to have a diversity of folks from sectors. We're going to talk Hollywood and entertainment and pop culture. We're going to talk art. We're going to talk about kind of campaigns and political messaging. There's going to be a whole host of conversations over the course of the next several months. But the key piece here, and I'm so appreciative of Joseph and Laura and Paige for our contribution to this conversation, is laying the groundwork for how important narrative is, and the work that is ahead of us to create one that is compelling, and that moves people to the future that we want to see. So Paige, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. I think this was a great beginning to a series on something that's really fundamental to how we begin to move the country. And we'll have one next month. And we want to continue to have conversations about narratives, not only in the sense of politics and power, which is incredibly important, but what are the narratives we say through, as Erica was saying, through culture, through our religion, and through areas of our lives that people don't normally think of when they think of, oh, what is the message? What is the narrative story? Because it all comes together as a whole to move the country forward. So I want to thank everybody for coming, and I hope to see you next month. Thank you.